For over 40 years, the entire world was basically defined by a conflict that, well, it wasn't a normal war. There weren't massive armies clashing directly. Instead, it was this intense ideological battle, a global struggle for influence between two giants, the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the Cold War. It's a story of a world literally split in two, of secret wars fought in the shadows, and of humanity coming right to the edge of total nuclear annihilation. So, how did we get there? Let's dive in. Right after the unbelievable devastation of World War II, this famous line from Winston Churchill it hit the nail on the head. It perfectly captured the brand new reality. Europe was split. A metaphorical iron curtain had slammed down, separating the Soviet-controlled East from the US-aligned West. And that single dividing line, it would define global politics for decades to come. Okay, so how did we get to this point of such a sharp division? Well, it all started with two very, very different superpowers rising from the ashes of the war, and each one had a completely opposite vision for how the world should work. So, on one hand, you've got the United States. They came out of the war with a booming capitalist economy, and, this is the kicker, they were the only country with the atomic bomb. On the other hand, you have the Soviet Union, this huge communist power that had suffered an almost unimaginable loss, 27 million casualties. Think about that number. That loss shaped everything they did. Their leader, Joseph Stalin, was absolutely determined to create a buffer zone in Eastern Europe so they would never, ever face another invasion like that again. So you see, these weren't just small political disagreements. We're talking about two fundamentally opposed ways of seeing the entire world. The first real sparks of this new conflict started to fly when Stalin began putting pressure on countries like Iran and Turkey. America's answer came directly from President Harry Truman. He announced a brand new doctrine. From now on, the U.S. would provide military and economic help to any nation threatened by Soviet expansion. This, right here, became the blueprint for American foreign policy for an entire generation. And the Truman Doctrine gave birth to America's single guiding strategy for the whole Cold War. The key word is containment. The goal wasn't to attack communism where it already was. No, the idea was to build a kind of wall around it, to contain it and stop it from spreading any further. Seriously, almost every major American decision for the next 40 years can be understood through this one powerful idea. And containment wasn't just about military might. The U.S. had this belief that communism took root in places of economic desperation. So, to fight its appeal in a Europe that was just destroyed by war, they launched something called the Marshall Plan. They poured nearly $13 billion, and that was an absolutely immense sum of money back then, into rebuilding Western European economies, and, of course, promoting their own system of free markets. Now, the first big real-world showdown happened in Berlin. The city itself was a weird case. It was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the city itself was also divided among the Allies. In 1948, Stalin decided to test the West. He blockaded all the roads and railways into West Berlin, basically trying to starve them out. But here's the thing. Instead of sending tanks, the West responded with the incredible Berlin airlift. For 15 months, they flew in food, fuel, everything, until Stalin finally backed down. It was this amazing show of Western power and resolve. In the end, though, the crisis sealed the deal, and Germany was officially split into two separate countries.
But this conflict wasn't just about tense standoffs in Europe. Oh no, this ideological battle quickly spilled over into real bloody wars all over the globe. But these were conflicts fought in the shadows, not by the superpowers directly, but by their stand-ins or their proxies.
So what was the justification for America getting involved in all these faraway places? It all came down to this one simple but really powerful idea, the domino theory. It was this deep-seated fear that if even one small country fell to communism, its neighbors would just inevitably follow, just like a line of dominoes tipping over. And Korea was the first big test of this theory. In 1950, the communist North invades the South, and the U.S. jumps in, leading a United Nations force to push them back. After 3 absolutely brutal years and more than 2 million casualties, the war ended in a stalemate. The border was almost exactly where it started. But from Washington's point of view, it was a win. Communism had been contained. But, and this is a big but, the containment policy had its limits. The difference between Korea and what happened in Vietnam is just stark. While Korea was seen as a success for containment, Vietnam was a total catastrophic failure. The US got bogged down in this long, incredibly divisive war, eventually had to pull out, and then watched as the entire country was unified under communist rule. And the human cost was just staggering. Over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese lost their lives. Now, as bloody as these proxy wars were, there was always a much, much bigger fear looming over everything: a direct nuclear war between the two superpowers. And in the early 1960s, the world came terrifyingly, unbelievably close to that happening. For 13 days in October of 1962, the entire planet just held its breath. The Cuban Missile Crisis was, without a doubt, the single most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War. It was the moment the hands on the doomsday clock came closest they've ever been to midnight. It all started when American spy planes found something terrifying: Soviet nuclear missiles being set up in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. President Kennedy's response was a naval quarantine, which is basically a blockade. As Soviet ships headed straight for that blockade line, tensions just went through the roof. It was an unbearable game of nuclear chicken. Thankfully, a last-minute deal was made. The Soviets would take out the missiles, and in return, the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. Look, to really get how serious this was, you have to understand this. The U.S. military went to DEFCON 2. Let that sink in. That is one single step away from all-out nuclear war. It is the only time in American history that has ever happened. The world was literally preparing for the end. And what's just incredible is that the fate of the world may have come down to the decision of one man. On a Soviet submarine near the blockade, the captain thought they were being attacked and ordered the launch of a nuclear torpedo. Now, protocol said 3 senior officers had to agree. 2 of them said yes. One man, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. He refused. That single act of defiance, that one no, likely stopped a nuclear war that would have destroyed the planet. The absolute terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of shocked both sides. It led to a new approach, a period we call détente, which is a French word that just means an easing of tensions. It was a time of arms control treaties and this mutual, unspoken understanding that they had to figure out how to manage their rivalry, or they would end up destroying everything. But that period of détente didn't last forever. And when the end of the Cold War finally did come, it came so fast and in a way that almost nobody saw coming. See, in the 1980s, U.S. President Ronald Reagan came in with a much, much tougher stance. He famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire and started a policy of peace through strength. What did that mean? A massive military buildup, designed to basically force the Soviets into an arms race he knew their broken economy couldn't possibly win. And at the same time, a totally new kind of leader took over in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev. He saw that the Soviet system was basically rotting from the inside out. So, in a last-ditch effort to save it, he introduced 2 radical new ideas: perestroika, to restructure their failing economy, and glasnost, a policy of openness to try and deal with all the corruption. But, giving people a little taste of freedom after they've had none for decades, well, that turned out to be a very dangerous gamble. So the Soviet Union was just getting squeezed from every direction. You had this immense external pressure from Reagan's military spending, and then internally, their own economy was collapsing, and people were getting restless. Gorbachev's reforms were supposed to be like a safety valve, but instead, they just blew the lid right off decades of frustration. And then the collapse happened with a speed that was just astonishing. In 1989, country after country in Eastern Europe realized the Soviets weren't going to stop them anymore, and they had these democratic revolutions. Then on November 9th, the most powerful symbol of the entire Cold War, the Berlin Wall, came crashing down. Just 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself just peacefully dissolved. The 40-year conflict ended with a stunning, quiet fizzle. The Cold War literally drew the maps of the 20th century. It created the alliances, it started the conflicts, and it ended not with a big bang, but with a whimper. But that leaves us with a really important question for today, right? After 40 years of carving the world into 2 enemy camps, has the legacy of that division and all the tension that came with it, has it ever really gone away?